you very much. And it looks like we're being recorded, so keep all of your ribald comments to yourself. Anyhow, we're going to talk today a little bit about how GIS can help you in an evaluation. Like I said, here's a little bit about me. I have spent most of my career, the past 25 years, evaluating environmental programs. Mostly I did this for the EPA at the Environmental Protection Agency. This gave me really fantastic opportunities to look across the country at environmental programs and try and understand what was working, where, why, and how to replicate that. You know, that also enabled me to participate in some really important, helping resolve some really important environmental and human health risks, like looking into the Flint drinking water crisis. I came up to y'all's neck of the woods for that work, and it took us a few years and about 175 interviews to dig into that. But it was a really valuable experience for me, and I think that our results were valuable to the EPA and hopefully the people of Flint in helping resolve the crisis that was ongoing at that point and help prevent it from happening in the future. The main things for y'all today are to know that I know a little bit about GIS and environmental science, and that is why I'm here talking to you today. And this little cabbage down here in the bottom is for me to remind you that, or to remind me to tell you that I'm sitting in Atlanta, Georgia. I live in this strange little neighborhood in Atlanta called Cabbage Town. So that's my little logo for my neighborhood. So thank you for letting me join you from so far away. It's still warm down here. If you want to come and visit, you're welcome. So before I dive in, I kind of wanted to know a little bit about what y'all know. See, I said y'all. You could have already known that I was from Atlanta. What y'all know about GIS. So in the chat, if you're online or if you're in the room, if you could just kind of think through what your knowledge is about GIS and the techniques associated with it. And I've given you pollen here for what do the letters GIS stand for. That's number one. A little acorn, which is I've done it, or I've worked with some others who've done some GIS work. And then number three is our oak tree. I'm an expert. And if you're an expert, that's awesome, because you're going to help me answer the questions at the end of this session, if we have any. I've got a number 2 in the chat, a number 1. Great. Number 2. Great. And yeah, I don't know, John, if you want to unmute y'all and just kind of like yell out some numbers in the room there. We've got another number 2.
1.
I'm a 1. Solid 1.
I'm a 1.
Ones. We got a 1.5 in the chat, which I love. It's like, yeah, I'm not really the acorn. That's totally what I would answer if someone gave me 3 options.
I know what GIS stands for.
Well, that's good. That helps. That's why you're a 1.5. Yeah. That helps. Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much, y'all, for participating in that little poll. So we're going to start today talking about what the letters GIS mean, just so that we're all in the same place. But ideally, our route today, this is us in our little VW bus. There's only 3 of us in here, and we're apparently using our legs at the bottom to help it along the track. But this is us, and we're on this little journey today, and we are headed towards GIS utopia. So my hope is that by the end of our talk today, you'll feel like, oh yeah, this could be really useful for me. And I see how we could do some really interesting things by incorporating some geographic information into our evaluations. So we're going to do that by first talking about what a GIS is. Then we're going to talk about how or where, really, geographic information can inform program evaluations. I'm going to give you an example, and it's a fictitious example. So we'll talk through that and we won't hurt anyone's feelings. We're going to talk about where you can find geographic data. And then I'm going to introduce a couple of tools. And I hope that you're excited about that part, because the spoiler is that it's pretty easy. There's some great, easy tools out there, getting better every day. And then we'll have some Q&A at the end, some time for talking about things. I'll mention also, if you have questions in the intervening slides, please feel free to type them in. And if we're about to get to it, I'll be like, hang on a minute. And if we're not, we'll discuss it at the moment. Same thing in the room. Please feel free to interrupt me. I do this kind of stuff for a living, so you will not throw me off. So what is a GIS? It's a geographic information system. Geographic means that it's inherently spatial. It talks about where something is on the globe. Information, of course, we're talking about what, not just that latitude and longitude point, but what's the information about that point? So I've written here, we provide information about space, which is kind of like the bigger area that you occupy, place, which has both a geographic component in it, latitude and longitude, and also kind of like you know, a human component to it. What does that place mean? I mentioned at the beginning that I live in this weird little neighborhood called Cabbagetown. That gives me a sense of place. It's got this embodied information associated with it. Proximity, how close or far we are from something, or direction, how, you know, how do we get someplace? Direction is the way that most of us, including me, interact with the GIS on a day-to-day basis. Atlanta, I don't know how many of y'all have been here. I have lived here for 11 years and I could not get around this city without Google Maps. I don't even know what people did before Google Maps. Apparently Atlanta existed before Google Maps, but I don't know how anyone navigated it. The system part, the last letter in our GIS acronym, is the really important point here. The system part is that we take all this geographic information and then we draw and study the connections between those places, those spaces. We try to understand direction and proximity as it relates to the subject that we are particularly interested in at the moment. So taking that system part, we're going to try and understand this a little bit better. And all of y'all who answered 2 or would have answered 3, but you didn't for some reason, you already know this part. But for those of us who are 1s or 1.5s, the system part is that GIS usually is comprised of layers of information. It's, if you think about old like transparencies, like acetate transparencies, it's like you could take a bunch of those things and layer them on top of each other and then put a pin through the middle and understand what the information was that goes through all of those different layers. So we might start with a really basic layer, like what's the topography? What are the hills? Where are the lakes and the valleys and the creeks? We might add another layer that's political boundaries, county boundaries, state boundaries, national boundaries, city limits. That might be something of interest to us. And then we're going to add a couple of other layers on top of that. Maybe we'll start, this is where you're going to start seeing your evaluation terms. We'll start looking at where our interventions are located, pinpointing on the map where our education program lives, where our stream restoration or our stream cleanup program lives. And then we can start mapping our output locations as well. Okay, how many people attended our workshop? Where are they from? Where did we host the workshop? And then finally, we can just add more layers, right? We can start mapping our outcomes if there are locations associated with those, which because we live on the globe, there are. It's just a matter of how we understand those. And we can start mapping impacts. And to me, that's kind of the golden part of this process is as evaluators, we have challenges and have to be really careful about understanding and describing causal relationships. And the more that we can apply geographic information, I think the closer we can get to, we can kind of edge up towards that, those discussions of causation, of course, continuing to be pretty careful about it. So a couple more terms, and we're not going to need to know these for long, don't worry about it. But, since this is a primer, I thought I would provide some primary terms. A point, these are the kinds of things that we can look at in a GIS. A point, you know what a point is, it's a dot on a map. It's a pin. It's where you ask your Lyft driver to pick you up or drop you off. It's the place where the park is. It's the place where the bank is. It's a one-dimensional thing. It's just a point in space on a map. We use these every day when we're using Google Maps or for example, Lyft or Uber or something like that as well. A line is a straight or a curvy, a line is a straight or a curvy connection between 2 or more points. So it's 2-dimensional. It's got an X and a Y. It's got a width and a length or something like that you're looking at, a distance that you're looking at. It can be a route, can be how your Lyft driver is getting you from point A to B. It can be a borderline. It can be a street, a municipal street. A polygon is a shape, of course, you know this from your 8th grade science classes. A polygon is 2-dimensional. We're moving up in the 2-dimensional world here. So it does have a length and a width. It has, it does not have a 3rd dimension. That's our key point here. It could be your municipal boundary that we just talked about. It could be a service area for a business. It could be an area of influence for a nonprofit, for example. The last thing we're going to talk about is a raster. And this is important. It's going to sound like it's not important, but trust me, it has this Z information. It's three-dimensional. So people will say that rasters include continuous data. And if you're a math nerd, you'll know that this is a lie, because rasters are actually made up of little boxes. It's not actually continuous. But anyway, the principle is to provide information about data across a continuum. So that Z information, so the X and the Y are just your polygon information. It's the shape that you're looking at. But that Z information can be anything. It can be topography, is a really easy way to think about it. My little dorky example of a raster here, I shaded orange from dark to light. So that could be like a hill, for example. It could be like higher up at this light colored point here and lower down at the bottom. So y'all have seen this probably on maps when you're looking at topography. But that Z information can really be anything. It can be information about population. It could be information about the influence of your program. It's basically that additional piece of information that allows you to contextualize that shape. Instead of just showing the polygon where you're like, here's the city limits, you're able to say, here is, the average wage distribution within those city limits. You're able to add some information to that. This is my pop-up here. This is our bigger picture of our raster. It really is made up of individual cells. And so for those of you who want to understand how it works a little better, this is how it works. Each of those if I could twist this, if I was a better PowerPoint whiz or paid more attention, I would have twisted this little box so that it aligned with this line. So each little box, this raster is filled with these little boxes, and each one has this Z information, whatever that information is that we're interested in, included. And those boxes can be different sizes depending on how much computing power you have, how much time you have, and how much data you have. Census tracts are a great example of this. You can create a raster and the little boxes can be census tracts across that raster. So I'm not going to, again, if you've got questions, please type them in. I know this is a lot of information at the beginning, but we're going to put some context to it right now. So if you want to ask a question, please feel free to do so. I think as we move forward, you'll see that those terms are going to just kind of, hopefully they're going to make a little bit more sense as we continue moving here. So where can we intersect GIS with program evaluation? I'm going to just give a couple of examples here, 3 examples. So we know there are various types of program evaluations, right? And we're going to just do 3 examples here: strategy, process, and outcome evaluation. So let's say in our strategy evaluation, we're asking, did we design the program right? Is the program designed for success? Let's say in our process evaluation, we're asking, how's it going? How's the implementation moving along? Is it going along as we planned it? And then my favorite kind of evaluation, the outcome evaluation, we're asking these bigger questions like, is our program really achieving its goals? So if we want to incorporate some GIS, some geographic information into our strategy evaluation, here's a couple examples. So we're asking if our program is designed for success. And the kinds of questions we can ask are things like, are we targeting the intervention in the right geographic area? Do we have information about underlying conditions that we can map and then overlay our intervention and just kind of make sure, okay, yeah, we're looking in the right county, we're looking in the right school district, we're looking in the right neighborhoods to target this intervention. Another question is, are there connections between communities that we need to understand? One of my favorite examples of this is that, if you've got a major highway or a major interstate, you may look at an area, geographic area, and see it as a block. But if you're able to consider that barrier, that geographic barrier that is an interstate or even a major state highway, you might have fewer connections across that general area. So are there other connections that we want to understand? Okay, Kieran asks if I'm referring to causality or correlation when thinking about outcomes and population-based interventions. Yeah, interventions. Yeah, that's essential. And we need to be super careful whenever we're talking about causality. We're generally, with mapping, we're correlating. But I'm going to talk a little bit about spatial statistics. So just like we can use, regular mathematical statistics to try and explore causal relationships with any set of data. There are geospatial statistics that we can use to try and explore causality when we're looking at geographic data. So we're not going to go into that too much today, but I will mention a couple of them in a little bit. I think it is safest to assume that you're talking about correlation when you're doing these things, and you know, until you get into those spatial statistics. You can still tell an interesting story with correlation, certainly. So yeah, great question. So second type we're going to talk about here is process evaluation. Are we doing okay? How are we implementing our program? So this would be, are we reaching our intended communities and populations? So we might know a little bit about where the interventions are happening, and we might have a separate set of data that is about, you know, community characteristics. So if we overlay those two things, we can draw some conclusions about whether our interventions are actually occurring in the neighborhoods or communities or ecosystems, for example, where we hope for them to occur. And then the second question is similar in this case. Are there unexpected barriers to implementation that are caused by geographic factors? So as we start layering these things, as we start mapping our interventions and geographic characteristics, is there something that's popping up that's unexpected? A great example of this is when you have like a county boundary and your organization, say you're working for a nonprofit and you're doing a statewide intervention, and you realize that there's some kind of a difference in uptake of the intervention or results of the intervention along a line. You might find that that is a county boundary where people no longer have access to a particular type of funding or a particular school district's after school program or something like that. So trying to understand whether there are geographic factors that you may have not, or the people who designed the program may have not considered in the very beginning. It's another way we can use that information. And then last, can we show a change over time that geographically coincides with our intervention? And this gets exactly at Kieran's question about causation versus correlation here. So number one, we want those things to align. We want the intervention and the outcome to align, right? That helps us understand that in the places where we conducted our intervention, changes occurred. So it is one tool that we can use to help us better understand those kinds of relationships. So as you're considering whether and how to use geographic information, you know, we all collect all this data, right? In program evaluation, we put it into databases, we put it into spreadsheets, for example, and in order to do all of our analyses, all of our quantitative analyses of the data we collect, we have to have a unique identifier in our database. So when you're using geographic information, you can use location as the unique identifier. I mentioned that, you know, the old kind of version of GIS was all these layers of like transparent paper on top of each other, and then you put a pin through the middle. That's your unique identifier. So you're, for that one location, that one in my example here, that one point location, you are able to look at across that database of all the information that pertains to that particular point. It's easy to gather this information. Street spoiler for our tools, street addresses are pretty easy to map these days. If your data are grouped by county or by state or by country, that can be your unique identifier. It could be every piece of data for this country even. Of course, there's all sorts of important considerations about data quality and things to make, but your location can become the unique identifier. So let's just walk real quickly through this example. I'm talking way more than I thought I was going to, so we're going to move quickly through this example. This is one of my favorite places on the planet that's near Atlanta. It's called Davidson Arabia Mountain Nature Preserve. And if we think about a program that's designed to foster protection of the ecosystems there, we can start building a little GIS. Here's Atlanta. There's this tiny green spot right here that you can't see, but don't worry, I'm going to blow it up for you. There it is. This is the Davidson Arabia Mountain Nature Preserve. And if we start thinking about our basic logic model, we don't have to talk about all the problems with logic models today, do we? But anyway, for the sake of this presentation, we're going to use a basic logic model where we're kind of like planning out this, again, this is just a hypothetical program where we intend to increase protection of these natural assets out here on the right-hand side. Our goal is to have fewer vandalism events and improved trail stability at Arabia Mountain. And then we're going to do these activities over here, these environmental education activities like school field trips, summer camps. We're going to have a workbook. We're going to do an art contest. And then we're going to start measuring our outputs. How many of these activities are we conducting? We're going to start looking at our interim outcomes. Maybe we're doing some pre-tests and post-tests and showing change in knowledge, for example. And then we're going to start measuring our midterm, what I've called our midterm outcomes here, our behavior changes. And these are things like spreading the interest in the park, kids coming back for multiple events, this kind of stuff. And then our connection here to our long-term outcome is we hope that these kids who have demonstrated an interest in the park are practicing these protective habits that we've been teaching them. So which of these things can we map? Well, first of all, we can map the locus of our activities. We can map where we're doing the field trips and where we're doing the summer camps. And Cheryl, did you want to ask a question? Okay, I was just unmuting and I wanted to make sure I offered you the opportunity to speak up. Oh, no worries. Okay, we can also easily map our outcome location, right? This is what I've already done. We can map the park on a micro level. We can map the park's trails. We can map where there are departures from the trail, where there are vandalism events that occur. So we can really map out well on kind of a small scale, a fine scale, what's going on Arabia Mountain in that park. But there's a lot of other things we can start mapping. We can start looking at how far our reach is. Where are the kids coming from who are doing these summer camps and the field trips? And we can really map a lot of these midterm outcomes too. We can map who comes back with their parents and where they're coming from. How far are they driving? And whether there's new schools participating. So we can start seeing the geographic expansion of our program by starting to map some of these other pieces in here. And again, this is just a hypothetical example, but I threw it into a GIS here so that we could look at it. Here's our area again. Here's some examples of things we could do for, just to kind of add some data. And this is all free data that's out there on the internet for anyone to look at and use. This is information from the 2020 census on the number of children in census tracts. So you can start looking at, you can barely see under here the word Atlanta. So we're looking at a pretty big area here, but you can start seeing like, okay, there's some areas with a lot of kids that are pretty close to this park. Maybe those are some areas to target for our program. You can add on to that, where are the county schools located in the vicinity of this park? And, you can see this closest one is the Barack H. Obama Elementary Magnet School of Technology. That sounds like a pretty good place to find some participants in our field trips. Maybe these are some of the kids who would want to come back with their families on the weekend. So you can see how we might use that information for planning. And then as we collect data in our program, and again, this is just Katie pulling together a spreadsheet here. Got addresses of some of the schools. I want you to see in this little box, some of these have zip codes, some of them don't. There's commas in some, there's not in others. The GIS out there right now, and this is in ArcMap, but also in other tools that we're going to talk about, are really flexible about how you enter address information and do a very good job of locating that information. You need to check it, but they do a pretty good job natively. And then I just filled in some numbers here for the number of students that participated in field trips in my imagination, the number that participated in summer camps and family visits. And then I just made this kind of like influence score here, which is the total interactions. So we can easily start mapping some of these things. Here's where we've just added the number of students who took a field trip to that map of schools. And the dot, the size of the dot is the size of the field trip. So we can start seeing, you can imagine this in like a report, an evaluation report, that the larger, you could even expand these even further. The larger the dot, the more students attended a field trip at our green park down here. This is that influence score, that kind of like combined metric that I just invented that, may be invalid because of my imaginary example here. But this is this influence score that we created where we said how many students attended a field trip and then came back for summer camp, and then brought their families back. Those three things combined. And what we've done here is we created a hotspot. These are little heat maps, right? So you can see in my fictitious example that indeed Barack H. Obama Elementary Magnet School of Technology, which is quite a mouthful, especially for an elementary school student, in my example, had the most students that attended, came back for summer camp, and brought their families back. But with this kind of information, you can kind of see cold spots as well, right? You can see that these schools up here, they don't have as big of an influence. Or we have not had as big of an influence on those schools in our fictitious program. So we can use that information to start asking additional questions, right? This is where we're kind of getting to, by correlating the information, it leads us to asking additional questions. Okay, at schools where our theory of change is panning out nicely, can we explore why? We can ask the opposite question as well. We can ask how far families are driving to visit the park with their kids after a field trip. We can ponder whether maybe there's kids that want to go even further. We can ask what other field trips the kids at the less frequently visiting schools are doing and why are they doing those? What could we do to compete with other field trips, I suppose? So, you know, there's a bunch of different questions that could pop up just by kind of looking at, this is just visualizing these data here. So now we're on to all the good news. Free geographic data sources are plentiful. So you can see on this little thing, this is data.gov. This is the federal government's data website. It's fantastic. This was under development when I was working at the EPA. And you can see I just typed in the term GIS, which may not even be included in all geographic data sets in here, and hit enter. And I got over 45,000 data sets that could include free government. I mean, it's not free, right? We already all paid for it in the US anyway. Free geographic data sources that you can download and use for your evaluation purposes. Geoplatform.gov takes a more specific look at data available for geographic analyses. And these, geoplatform.gov, when you arrive at the website, which y'all can do right at this moment, you may see even more than this number when I pulled it a couple of days ago. Over 100,000 total data sets for using, free download and use in your programs. This is from, again, from my state. Your state probably has, in fact, I know that Michigan has excellent geographic GIS professionals at the state level who collect and provide data. So your state probably provides you with additional free geographic information for your use and download. In this case, I did a search for schools, and then you can see there's this layer that you can download. This is a point layer. You can see all these dots, right? So these are just point data of schools. And then there are also plentiful data sources out there that provide you with information about humans, what we call human geography in the geography world. The UNEP provides a bunch of information. There's, basically if you can Google it and find a data source and find its provenance, make sure that you have some good metadata about where it came from, who collected it, and all that stuff, you can find excellent information. Kieran asks a question: are you assuming, in my example that I provided, are you assuming that these magnet schools are pulling students from their immediate surroundings and not, say, the Decatur area? This would be the same catchment area issue as with any fixed place schools, health clinics, et cetera. Yeah, that's an important part of designing a geographic analysis methodology that makes sense. I think just like, when we're doing a survey design, for example, in an evaluation, we need to think carefully about who's going to be included in that sample that we survey. And so if we think about geographic data as in kind of in the same ways, we need to make sure that we're being super thoughtful about where those, the source of that information, the validity and reliability of that information. I think with schools, if we're starting out talking about field trips, it would be important to know that that's the school that the kid attends, because the school controls the field trip. But if we moved, for example, from there to coming back with their families, we might want to collect additional data about where the family is because of what you're talking about. Like if it's a magnet school, that kid could be coming from pretty far away, and we would want to understand that information. So yeah, I think carefully understanding and exploring those types of questions as we're looking through these data sources is really important to the validity and reliability of our study. And remember, we said this earlier, almost any data source can be geocoded. Again, if you've got addresses associated with your information, this is an important point. Addresses are PII. People's individual addresses are PII. So make sure you remember that if you're doing some mapping of individual houses. But if it's something like schools or businesses or other locations, you're probably good to go. But of course, be careful as you're looking at individuals' addresses that you're not revealing any PII. It can be if you provide a map that has a good scale, it can be considered providing personally identifiable information, which is what PII means to me right now. So make sure you're careful about that. But if your data has street addresses or is specific, as we said earlier, to cities, counties, states, or countries, you can map those data. You can also record locations when you're collecting the data. So if you're collecting your own geocoded data, there's a bunch of tools for you to do this. I'm going to talk about just two simple ways to do it. One is if you're associated with a university, which I think most of y'all are, you may have access to ArcGIS Online. There's a pro tip on a subsequent slide that says, just go in there and start messing around. What could go wrong? So there are plenty of tools available through ArcGIS Online. One of them is, y'all may know about or have remember Survey 123. A great survey tool. Well, Esri, the company that owns ArcGIS, has purchased Survey 123. So that is great news for those of us who want to geocode our data. You can go into ArcGIS and you can click on the Survey 123 button and you can build a survey that will geocode responses. So here's an example of like the form that you use to set up this survey. It's super easy. You can just click over here and decide what types of information you're trying to provide, just like if you were using SurveyMonkey. But you can include geographic information in that. See, there's this little location spot right down here. You can include a map or you can type in an address. So you can use, if you're doing a survey already and you want to include information, remember to be careful about PII, people's individual addresses. You could use Survey 123 to design that survey and automatically collect geocoded information. This is your iPhone or your whatever Galaxy phone. This is the other way that you can do this. Within Google Maps, I like to use a little program called Gaia GPS. It's a hiking thing I used it for hiking in the past. You can get a GPS location, a latitude and longitude location by dropping a pin on your phone. So if you're somewhere and you want to record the location, you can do this on your own cell phone and export those data so you can use them later on. It's not super accurate, and so this is how you can tell that I was a remote sensing person in the past. It's not like super accurate to within like a couple of feet. So if you were using this information to do like a native plant survey, it would not be good enough. But if you're using this information to map general locations, the location of a park entrance, for example, within a few meters, you're probably pretty good just using your cell phone and checking the information later on, and that'll give you a point. Okay, we're almost done here and almost ready for more discussion. So if we're going to start analyzing these data, this is where I said I was going to start mentioning things like spatial statistics. I've listed just a couple of examples here. This is, of course, people get advanced degrees just in spatial analysis, and we're just talking about this, like ways to get started here. So I've listed them from less complex to more complex. Visual observation is great. Like just looking at a map, just looking at information on a map can give you a ton of interesting information. This is an example that I used doing a presentation about remote sensing in the past. It was actually about remote sensing using drones, which is a really, really cool thing that we can all do together sometime when I come to Michigan. It's really fun. But this was an example of identifying and tracking harmful algal blooms just with visual information. So this is just a picture basically from a drone. And you can see these plumes in here that are actually the beginnings of harmful algal blooms. And you can see that they're starting by the shoreline and they're traveling along the water. So just observing information visually is really valuable. We saw a heat map with little hot spots earlier. Here's another one that's for population from the 2010 census. So just, you know, when people map heat maps, they tend to map higher numbers as red and lower numbers as green. Think about people who might have color blindness or other visual impairment when you do that. And think about whether it places a value on the information. People tend to perceive things pictured in red as bad and green as good. So if you don't intend to imply that there's a value, you might want to choose a different scale. But this is an easy way to look at a heat map, right? The red areas are the areas where there are more people, and the green areas are the places where there are less people. Fewer people. And so you can also use these things to map anything, like we did with our little example of the school. Wherever your Z, wherever that additional element that you're mapping is higher, you can create a heat map so that you can quickly show to a reader or to yourself as you're proceeding with the evaluation places where you might want to focus more attention. Do you want that low number to be higher? You focus in the cool spots. Do you want that high number to be lower? Like, for example, a lot of the work that the CDC here in Atlanta does, you focus on those hot spots. So spatial statistics are ways to really apply kind of like some traditional statistical tests to geographic information. So a question that I've put in parentheses here is a great example of how you might pose a statistical question to geographic information. It would be, how likely is it that the observations that we have would occur randomly across a landscape as compared with clustering around a central point? So I've put a youth center in there. I've got an example I'm working on right now in an evaluation with a youth center. So that's top of mind for me. But you know, this is a great example of like correlation as well. If there's a population center, you would expect clustering around a population center. You wouldn't expect it to be random. So a spatial statistic about, you know, anything that's associated with higher population should have a high correlation to population centers. But you can use these spatial statistics to kind of look at how much more likely is it that data would be clustered versus random for anything that you're viewing. Another thing spatial statistics are frequently used for, and this is a great example that people use in labs all the time. It's like, where do you put your McDonald's? So, or where do you put your 7-Eleven? So the companies have been using these tools for years to identify the best locations for their businesses. In my case, I've said, how can you tell if a youth center is located in the best site? And there's a lot of information that feeds into that, right? Access, road speeds. Do you want it where the speed limit is 55, or do you want it where the speed limit is 35 so people are moving slower? Proximity to other businesses. You know, when they put in a McDonald's, what goes in across the street? A Burger King. Or when they put in a mattress firm, what goes in across the street? Another mattress firm. I don't know if y'all have heard that podcast, but it's fantastic. They do that on purpose. The last item I've got in here is, I'm just going to mention quickly, which is AI object identification, artificial intelligence object identification. There's so much. I've got a whole other presentation about this stuff. It's super cool. So you can train remote sensed imagery to identify information for you. And that can be a part of your analytical method for collecting information about the impact of a program or an intervention. So from simple things that we do every single day, just looking at a map and trying to understand what it tells us, to complex, there are a lot of different ways to analyze information. Good news is there are easy tools for us to use. Did y'all know you can map information in Excel? It's pretty cool. So you take your table. This is another fictitious example that I created. So you take your little table. This is an Excel table, right? I've got city, county, state, and then this funding thing that I just made up, a bunch of numbers here. You select your county, and in this case, your county and your state and your funding. And then you go up here to insert. And then there's this little map, this little globe right here. And you click on filled map. And then look at that. Excel will generate this filled map for you. So it knows, because of my little spreadsheet here, that all of my data is from Georgia. It knows that this is a county column, and it fills in the counties, you know, with this kind of like hot to cold coloring, shading here based on that funding information. So this is a great basic way, not really for analyzing information, but for presenting information, particularly in a report, if you're working on a report. So if you've already got it in Excel, may as well try it. Just select the columns and hit map and see what happens. You can also, for those of you who use Tableau, Tableau's got some really great mapping capabilities as well. This is some data that I was playing with that's about combined sewer overflows, because that's how exciting my evaluation life is. So you can, you know, you've got this information already in there. You can just click on map and it will start mapping the data that you've included. You can also do some basic analysis of geographic information in Tableau. So down here at the bottom, I've got this calculated column where I was calculating the estimated cost to bring a combined sewer system into compliance. That's a number that, you know, that came from, in this case, that came from the EPA. So you just hit that, you're like, yep, I want to see that. And then again, like we saw with our previous example, you can choose how you want that data to appear. So these are larger circles for larger costs to bring that system into compliance. Up here in the top right-hand corner is kind of the legend for what we're looking at in millions of dollars. So these are monstrous projects that take decades to complete, but you can start doing some of that analysis and presenting some of that information in a little bit of a different way here. You can create a calculated column in Tableau, as you all probably know if you use Tableau for other purposes, by multiplying columns together. So you can also do that and map those data as well. You can visualize information in, I've mentioned ArcGIS already. It's the program that most people who use GIS are most comfortable with, including me. There's a program called QGIS. Some people call it QGIS, which is free. It's open source. It's downloadable. A word of caution, you kind of need to know a little bit about what you're doing to make it work right. But just like with other coding, with other programming languages, like anything else that y'all have done with computer programming in the past, like Python, for example, you can go out to the internet and you can find other people's QGIS codes and borrow them, as long as you trust them and trust their provenance. But QGIS is a free alternative to ArcGIS and is pretty powerful. You can also use Google Earth. If you haven't looked at Google Earth in a while, it has increased its capabilities and its functionality. Google Earth uses these things called KML files, and you can take your information in a program like Excel and turn it into a KML file and upload it into Google Earth. Look it up on the Google machine. Speaking of Google, here's my pro tip. If you have access to ArcGIS, it's gotten so much more user-friendly over the years. I recommend just going in there, playing around, getting a username, you know, you're always welcome to call me. So yeah, so call me, give me a call if you want to work through it together. I'd be happy to walk you through it. So if you want to do more about this, and we're going to move to questions in a second, at the AEA conference, I'm doing a session with a couple of other awesome geographer evaluator people on Friday. And for some reason, probably my fault, our title is the only title that is in all caps. So it's like we're yelling at you for that Friday session, incorporating geospatial data tools into evaluations. But it is that Friday, and we are preparing and getting ready to release a Geo Eval toolkit. So that will come out then, and then it will also be available for free, you know, through a website after that. So if you want to make sure that you have that, I mentioned a few different tools today. That toolkit's going to have about 20 different tools in it with basics on how to get started. I mentioned Googling things. YouTube is fantastic. If you're looking in your ArcGIS through your university username, find a YouTube tutorial on how to get started. There's so much out there and people are really good at it. And then of course, you're welcome to contact me I'm happy to chat about this anytime. I do all sorts of things that aren't mapping, and every time I get to do mapping, I'm super psyched. So, yeah, what questions do we have? Cheryl has a question. She says, if I have zip code data from survey respondents, can I input this onto an existing map, like a state map? Is this map available in ArcGIS? Yeah, that's a great question. So when you get into ArcGIS, if that's the tool that you're using, there's a bunch of base layers, basically, like that kind of, when I started talking about the different layers, that basic layer that's just got political boundaries or topography or both. So you can get a state map for free within that. And start layering your data on top of that. There's a basic principle called a join, J-O-I-N, that you'll do in ArcGIS to start making sure that that data is combined in a way that's mappable. And if you're looking up YouTube tutorials, that's one of the first things those folks on YouTube are going to teach you. And Peggy asks, do you know if you need an add-in in Excel to map in the program? Yeah, I think it's one of those analysis add-ins. I have the most basic version of Excel, and I was able to add it in. So I think it should be available to most people, but you probably do need to go to add-ins and include it. And Brad reminds people that you're welcome to come off mute and talk so that people don't have to just listen to me talk this whole time. What else is on your minds? What other thoughts do y'all have about all this?
Hi, Katie. This is Lori Wingate in the room here at the Evaluation Center. My question is, are IP addresses geocodable? And if so, could you speak to the potential or limitations of using that sort of data in GIS?
That's a great question. So yeah, IP addresses are geocodable, georeferenceable, and it would be, I think you would want to make sure that you were making the same considerations that you would make with individual information, you know, personally identifiable information, PII, because if it's an IP address from a house, if it's an IP address from a school or something like that, you might not need to do that. But yeah, that's a great call. You know, another thing about, you know, just as with like survey data and, you know, collecting information, you want to make sure that people understand that you're collecting that information. So that would be another consideration to make, but it would be a shortcut instead of having to collect all those specific locations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, because my wheels were spinning. I was thinking about survey data, but also if that, I don't even know if you can get it through like your web analytics, if you can see who's visiting your website, but it just started making me think about like mapping your reach. And if you did a campaign in a certain area, would you get more people from that area going to a website and things like that? So, I mean, just curiosity. And while I was talking, I wonder if you could stop sharing your screen so then we can see you a little bit better in the room. And also while I'm off mute, if anybody else in the room has questions. Okay.
And that's, yeah, I mean, I think your point about survey data is great, and website visits. So I don't, you know, depending on what I don't even know what it's called, but like the company that does your website stuff, like if it's WordPress or Squarespace, they already are mapping those data. So yeah, that's great. That's a great shortcut for collecting data about people visiting on the internet or responding to surveys from a computer.
Following up on the geolocation and the personally identifiable information, do you know of any sort of quick way to sort of de-identify or take the precision off of those? So say you did have a bunch of addresses, or I know like in Qualtrics, they'll give you IP addresses or coordinates a lot of times for respondents. So you want to use them to maybe show a city or show counties or something where responses are coming from. Or just sort of like even maybe general areas like neighborhoods, but not have the specificity. So like, is there a quick way to sort of like turn that down or make it more vague automatically?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I think if you were using Survey 123 within ArcGIS, they would probably have a tool for making that happen quickly. I'm working on a project where we're not doing that in a quick way right now. So I can tell you the long way to do it. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a great, that like kind of like a generalizer button that would just kind of give you choose the radius, but it would take your point and turn it into a general area. kind of like what I'm thinking about is when you go into Airbnb or something and you're looking for a place and it's just like, it's generally in South Atlanta, and they won't give you that precise location until later on. I had another thought about that. Oh, and of course, you know, I think if you're doing a survey and you're going through an IRB, that would be a great question to explore through that process, is like, what radius is de-identified enough to be protective, you know, depending on the subject and the information you're collecting. Great question. Any other questions out there? Anything that didn't make much sense? All of it didn't make much sense.
Hi, this is Lissa in the room at the Evaluation Center. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about this GeoEval toolkit that you plan on launching at AEA. So like what kind of things should we look forward to?
Thank you for asking. So we are my co-presenters and I have got 4 co-presenters. We have a really small group of people in AEA from different disciplines that like using GIS in our work, and we meet like once every other month to just chat. And so we kind of ginned up this idea for how do we get more people engaged in using geographic information. And we decided, kind of like that slide I had where it was like less complex to more complex, that we were going to create this toolkit that provided information for evaluators from less complex to most complex, that they could use and access in their own evaluations. So for example, we'll have a tool on using Excel. We'll have a page on how to use Microsoft Excel to map basic data. And then that'll go all the way up to a tool on doing spatial analysis to understand underlying trends. So like I said, I think we're going to have, be about 15 to 20 different tools. And our idea, you know, again, and we're all in the draft phase right now, trying to finalize these tools, but our principle is that each tool is 1 page, and it basically gives you an example of how to use it, a few steps to get started, and some additional information for how to proceed. Oh, and caveats. Don't use it in these situations, or, you know, make sure you're thinking about these situations. So yeah, there'll be a bunch of different tools covered there, including where to find more geographic information. And if you're not going to AEA, you can email me and I'll make sure you get a copy of it after we've got it finalized. Anything else out there? I appreciate y'all letting me talk like an auctioneer at you for 47 minutes today. Oh, sure. Share my email again. So I'll put it in the chat and I'll say it. So my email is Katie, Katie at geoliteracyproject.com. Geoliteracy Project is my website. So.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. It was great, really interesting information, and we look forward to seeing you at AEA. So let's.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks for having me.
So thank you, Katie, once again. Be sure to register for the next cafe. It will be on October 26th, where we'll be joined by Margaret Roller. She will be presenting on a quality approach to the in-depth interview method. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.